is. Some of these other options, the study of chemicals, that's more of chemistry related. The study of space, that's actually a part of physics called astrophysics. And then the study of animals, I thought this one would trick you guys, but it didn't, which is good. The study of animals is part of biology, but it's a smaller part of biology. That's more focused on, it's kind of we'll be discussing a little bit about it later today, but there's lots of different areas of biology that people can study. Animals is one group. Some people choose to study other groups like humans. Some people choose to study plants. It can really vary. It depends. But the overall uh, main focus of biology is the study of life and all living things. And so then I wanted to go into the characteristics of life. Since we just finished talking about how biology is the study of life and all living things, it would be a great idea to then talk about the characteristics of life. So these are just some common characteristics that everything that's considered life shares. So that would mean that living things are composed of cells. Living things have different levels of organization. Now, by that, I mean stuff like you can divide them up into different groups. So, for example, in our bodies, we have cells. Our cells come together to make our tissues. Our tissues come together to make our organs. And then our organs come together to make the systems in our body, such as the respiratory system or the circulatory system or our digestive system, any of those that help us live. If we were talking about maybe plants, it's a little bit different, but they also have areas inside them that organize together to form systems that help them function. The next point was all living things use energy. Now, this one's kind of a little bit easier to explain, right? All of us need energy to be able to do our work, right? If we're hungry, we're not going to be able to do our work very well. It's going to be very hard for us to do our work, so we have to eat. Plants, on the other hand, they don't necessarily eat stuff, but they will need the sun. So if you put a plant in a very dark place, it's not really going to grow that much. But if you put a plant outside where it's very, very bright, the sun always has light shining on it, then the plant will be able to grow because it can turn that light into energy. Now, the next major point is living things respond to the environment. So what I mean by that is if we think about if we think about us for a second, when we're hungry and we want something to eat, what do we normally do? Well, we go to the kitchen and we try and go maybe into the fridge and then we find something to eat, or maybe we ask our parents to make us something to eat, right? And then we eat food and we feel better. In the case of plants, if the sun isn't shining close to the plant, then the plant will try to grow towards the sun so that it can get more light. These are just some little small examples of how things that are alive will change their behavior so that they can promote life, so that they can continue to grow and continue to live. And that goes very nicely into the next point, which is that living things grow and develop. So again, going back to us, because using us as an example is always the best. We all start off as small little babies, and then as time goes on, as we get older, as our birthday comes every year, we grow. We get taller, we get bigger, we start to look a little bit different, you know. And as time goes on, we grow and develop. Same thing happens with animals, same thing happens with plants, same thing happens with bacteria. It doesn't really matter which living organism you're talking about. A characteristic that they all share is that they all usually start small and then they grow and develop into larger versions of themselves. The next thing that a lot of living organisms, if not all of them, do is reproduction. So that's by what I mean by that is making new forms of themselves. So for humans, that's when two people come together and you make a baby, right? That's how we came to be from our parents. But for cells, it's a little bit different. For cells, they don't necessarily do that. For some cells, like bacteria, little small ones, they just go and divide into two. So I can draw a little example of that. You'll have, let's pretend this was one cell. We'll draw a little nucleus inside. What'll happen is eventually that cell will grow. It'll get bigger and bigger until there's two nucleuses inside, and then it'll split in half, and that'll give us two new cells. So that's a form of reproduction that a lot of smaller organisms do, such as cells, bacteria, um, things like that. Larger organisms like animals and humans, we don't necessarily do that. We do sexual reproduction, which is how like babies are born and how we came to be. The next major point is that living things adapt to their environment. Now, this is something that we will talk a little bit more about a little bit later into the presentation, but I'm sure that some of you are probably familiar with this. It's the idea that as time goes on, the environment changes. And because the environment changes, animals and us included, anything that's alive needs to also change in order to survive. So, a very good example of that, again, I can use is us. If let's pretend in your house you're hungry and you want something to eat. So, you go to the fridge, you go to the kitchen, and you open your fridge and you see that there's nothing in there to eat. There's no food. The fridge is empty. Oh no. So what do you do? Well, you adapt by going to the grocery store and then you buy some food, bring it back to your house, put it in the fridge, and now you have food to eat, right? If you couldn't do that, if you weren't able to go to the grocery store and you couldn't buy any food, then you're not going to be able to eat, right? And then that's a problem because then you're going to stay hungry and then that's not good for you. So if we apply the same kind of thinking to other animals, it's kind of the same idea. And I have a good example that I'll show you a little bit later with that. Um, but this, I just wanted to introduce it very quickly here. So the next thing I wanted to go into was some of the unifying themes of biology. So if you remember, that's one of the major learning goals of today is to be able to understand the unifying themes. So our five main themes that we will be covering today are organization, information, energy and matter, interactions, and evolution. So starting with organization, I kind of just wanted to briefly go over how in every single level of life, we can kind of break it down into what's called a hierarchy. So we can start from, if I turn on my pointer again, we can start from the highest tier, which is the biosphere. That includes pretty much the entire planet, all the water, all living things, all ecosystems, everything on planet Earth. And we can go all the way down to the bottom where atoms are. And the idea here is that life is kind of split up into different systems, and all the parts of those systems have to be able to work together in order for the level that's above it to function properly. So, as an example, if we start with atoms, which are the smallest possible things that make up, they're kind of like the building blocks that make up stuff. Atoms will come together and they'll form molecules. Molecules will come together and they'll make what we call macromolecules, which are just larger things. So, an example would be you might have a few molecules of simple elements such as hydrogen and oxygen and carbon. And then a lot of those will come together and they'll form macromolecules, things such as glucose. I'm sure that you guys are familiar with glucose. A lot of us know what that is. It's sugar, right? Then those macromolecules will come together and they'll form organelles. So those are parts inside of our cells that help our cells do their jobs. So for example, that could be the mitochondria. Some of you might be familiar with that. It could be the nucleus, right? That's where DNA is held inside cells. It could also be the endoplasmic reticulum, right? There's lots of organelle, but all those organelle have to come together and work together so that they can make a proper functioning cell. And then as we go down, we kind of see how that trickles together. So the cells come together, and those will make what we call tissues. So in our bodies, our cells come together and they make the different tissues in our body. So, for example, the cells in our liver come together to make our liver, which would be our organ of the liver. The cells in our heart come together to make a heart. The cells in our lungs come together to make a lung. And all those cells have to work properly together so that they can make a proper functioning liver and a proper functioning heart and a proper functioning lung. And then all those organs have to come together to work together so that we can have functioning bodies. And then this kind of goes up until we get to the top, which is the whole planet, right? So all living things have to function together properly in order for the planet to work. Because if all living things didn't work together properly, then the planet wouldn't be able to support life the way that it does. And this is kind of a summary of what I was just saying, but basically, the hierarchy of life goes from atoms to molecules to organelle to cells, then tissues, organs, organ systems, organisms. Organisms make up populations. Populations come together to make up communities. So that would be a community would be like a lot of different populations of many different kinds of things. So for example, where we live right now or where you live, you have a community because there's populations of humans, there's also populations of insects, there's also populations of plants, there's also populations of animals, and all of that comes together to make the community that you live in. Then our communities come together to form ecosystems. So those would be like, we have all of the different parts of our community that come together. So all the organisms, and then those organisms all live in different areas. So, you live in your house, the insects live outside inside the ground, the plants live outside, the animals live outside, maybe some of them live in the water, and all together that makes up the ecosystem that you live in. And then we put all of our ecosystems together on the planet, and that gives us the biosphere, which is the everything that's living on the planet. Now, one important part of the hierarchy is emergent properties. Now, with emergent properties, the main point is that as you combine the different parts from going from the lower parts of the hierarchy to the higher parts of the hierarchy, you get new functions, you get new systems. So, a very good example of that is our organs and our tissues, right? So, our liver cells will combine together, and one liver cell by itself might not be able to do that much in your body. But when you have enough liver cells that it turns into a full actual liver, so the organ, now it's able to actually do stuff inside your body, right? So it's able to take care of your detoxify your blood, take care of your body, and do what it needs to do inside your body. And then once your liver functions properly and that works with your circulatory system, that's when you get proper organ systems that can help you live. That's an example of emergent properties. Now, another thing with organization is that structure and functions are always linked to each other. Now, this goes back to the cell being the basic unit of life, and we can actually divide cells up into two different categories. So we have prokaryotic cells and we have eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells have no organelles, and they're considered to be very, very simple organisms. So because they don't have organelles and they're very small, they're considered simple organisms. So their functions are not that crazy. They do very simple things. Eukaryotic cells, which are the ones that we have in our bodies, those are very complicated cells. They have lots of different organelle, they have lots of different parts, and so their functions are a lot more complicated. And here I have a little bit of an explanation, a little bit of a diagram to explain the difference. So on the left here, this is a eukaryotic cell. And on the right here, this little tiny cell is a prokaryotic cell. Now, one thing you'll notice right away is that the eukaryotic cell is way bigger. It's a lot larger. Um, and it also has lots of different organelle in it. We have a nucleus, we have tons of DNA inside, and all these little spots are membrane enclosed organelle. Whereas the prokaryotic cell, it has DNA, but it has very little DNA, and it doesn't really have any organelle. And so it's smaller, and it also doesn't have as complex of a function. Now, I know I've been talking for a while, so now I want to take some time to ask you guys some questions. So I have two questions. So the first question is, what is the smallest unit of light? Um, we already had one person answer, so I'm gonna ask Stella, what do you think the smallest unit of life is?
Um, is it just I think I forgot it.
It's okay. That's okay. You can take a guess.
So
Maybe it's A, the
I'm
cell.
not sure.
I'm not
Biosphere is
sure.
what? So I think
Biosphere.
it's the cell.
Sorry, which one did you pick?
I think maybe it's a cell.
It's A, the cell. Okay, good. That's the answer. Good, good.
Really?
Now, yeah, that is the answer. So the smallest unit of life is the cell. Now my next question is, which type of cell is more complex? Is it A, prokaryotic, B, karyotic, or both of them just as complex as each other, or are none of these complex? So I'll ask Lucas that. What do you think the answer is?
I forget it.
That's okay. You can take a guess. That's okay.
Mm,
Try your
I think
best.
it's B.
It's B. Yeah, that's right. Good. Good job. So again, the smallest unit of life is the cell, as Stella said, and then the most complex type of cell is B, eukaryotic, just like Lucas said. So good job, guys. So now the next area that we're going to go into is the next theme, which is the information theme. So here, this theme basically just focuses on how all the information inside of our bodies, inside of our cells, and everything is stored in DNA. And that's kind of the basic storage unit for all information inside of living things. Now, within DNA, you have these things called genes. Those are kind of sections of DNA that have very specific information stored on them that program cells to make specific kinds of proteins. And those proteins provide the cell with function. The process by which those proteins are made is called gene expression. And so, what I sometimes kind of try to relate this to is if you think of it as like a computer. So, the DNA would be like your hard drive on the computer, right? That's where we save all of our files to when we're working on a computer. And then the genes would be the specific files that we have on our computer. So, if you have, let's pretend you were doing a homework assignment and you had a homework assignment saved on your computer in one part of the computer, that would be an example of a gene. And then the gene expression would be you clicking on the homework assignment and then it opens it for you so that you can actually work on it and finish the assignment. So that would be like kind of like what the protein is. And then when talking about the information travel, it starts with the DNA and then it turns into something called mRNA, which I'll explain a little bit more in the next couple slides, but that's just another form of DNA that we can use. And then the mRNA is turned into protein. And then the protein goes on to make the cell have a function. So the protein could be anything. It could be maybe it could be a protein that helps us break down glucose inside of our cells. So that allows the cell to break down glucose and get energy. Or the protein could be something that maybe helps the cell divide so that the cell can grow and then split into two new cells. The point is, the information travels from DNA to then mRNA, and then from mRNA, it turns to protein, and then that gives the cell its function. Now here I have a little bit of an example. So this is the crystalline gene. So this would be a specific part of our DNA inside our cells. And what this gene is responsible for is helping our eyes focus light. So if we start from the DNA, we'll have our specific strands of DNA that make up this gene. So that's like the set portion from here all the way to here that now stores that information. It's going to go through a process called transcription. What transcription does is basically you're turning the DNA into mRNA so that you can then use that to turn it into protein, because our cells can't turn DNA directly into protein. They have to turn it into mRNA first. So if we go back to the computer example, your computer can save the file onto the hard drive, so that would be the DNA, but you have to take your mouse and go find the file before you can open it, right? So that would be the mRNA. You have to go find the file. So now, once we generate the mRNA, that goes through a process called translation. Translation is kind of like how we use our alphabet. So the information that's on the mRNA is in a certain order. We have these specific, they're called nucleotides. That's what the U, G, G, U, 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 G, G, C, U, C, A is. And those are kind of like the alphabet. So when you organize them into specific orders, that gives us words in real life, right? So if I gave you the letters T, A, and C, and I told you to organize them into a word, one of the words that you could make with that is cat. So this is kind of the same idea as that. Our cells then translate the mRNA into proteins, which are called chains of amino acids, because proteins are made up of amino acids. And then the proteins are folded together and they turn into a more complex shape that allows them to actually do their job. So in this case, the crystalline protein goes into our eyes and it helps us see. It helps us focus light so that we're able to see stuff. Now, I know this is very complex. This is just a small introduction to this. We will talk about this more later in the class, like in future weeks. There's a lot more detail here, but I chose to leave it out because I don't want to overwhelm you right now. So we will talk more about this a little bit later. Now, just to finish off the information theme, I just wanted to talk about these three main areas of study. So the first one is called genomics. Genomics is the study of DNA sequences of species. So what scientists do there is they look through the DNA of different kinds of animals or different kinds of bacteria or different kinds of cells, and they kind of map out what the information is. So they kind of make like a dictionary, and they see like how many different kinds of words that those things can make. And then they use that to figure out how different those organisms are from us. So for example, scientists have compared humans' genomes to like monkeys' genomes to see how similar we are to them. Another area of study is called proteomics. So that's kind of the same idea, except instead of looking at the DNA, we look at the protein now. So now they look at what the proteins look like. They look at what the protein's shape is, and then that tells them what the properties are. Another one is bioinformatics, and that's where scientists will take different genomes and they'll compare them to each other to help us understand the world. So that goes back to the example of the monkey being compared to the human. And on the left here, I have an example of what DNA looks like. You may have seen this before. It's called the double helix. So this is what our DNA actually looks like. And then on the right here, I have a breakdown of just one side of the DNA. So this is one strand of the DNA. And again, we have these letters over here, which are called nucleotides. And the order that they're in will give us different information. So that works basically just like how a dictionary does with words. So if I give you certain letters in real life and I tell you to make a word with it, you can make certain words with it. And in your body, your cell will give your DNA will have certain nucleotides that your cells can put together to make certain proteins, and that lets them do a certain job. Now, I have another question to ask you guys. I wanted to ask, where is all genetic information stored? Is it genomics? Is it in genes? Is it in DNA? Or is it in protein? So I think this time I'll ask Jessica. Okay, it looks like Jessica might not be able to unmute. That's okay. Did Emily want to try instead?
Mm,
So which one do you think it is?
I don't know.
Did you want to take a guess? I can give you a little hint if you want.
Mm,
So,
Mm.
so all of our genetic information is inside of our cells, and it's in a certain part of our cells. So it's not our genetic information tells us how to make proteins. So the answer is not D. And genomics is the study of genomes. So the answer is not A either. So the answer is going to be B or C. So which one do you think it is from B or C?
Can I help her?
Sure, sure.
I think it's in DNA. C.
Yeah, so the answer is DNA. So all of our genetic information in our cells is stored in DNA. And then in our DNA, we have certain regions called genes that tell us information for very specific kinds of proteins. Or they give us very specific information for certain things in the cell. Okay, good job, guys. So the next theme that I wanted to talk about was energy and matter. And the main point here is that all life requires energy to function. We kind of talked about this earlier when I was saying that if you're hungry, you have to eat food. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do your job properly. If you try to come to a class and you're hungry, you're not going to listen in the class. You're not going to have a good time in the class, right? But if you come and you ate food and you're full, then you're ready to learn and it'll be easy for you to pay attention. Now, some of the main points here are that energy has to be able to transfer from organism to organism in order for life to continue. Now, the reason for that is very simple. It's the idea that the fruits and the vegetables that we eat, they get energy from the sun. And then, so they would be what we call producers because they take energy from the sun and they turn it into chemical energy to help them grow and function. And then we would be things called consumers, which are any organism that eats producers or it gets energy from other consumers. So consumers would be things like us, animals, bugs, basically anything that is not a plant, because all organisms that aren't plants have to get energy from by eating other things or by consuming other things. And so that's why energy has to be able to transfer between organisms, because if the producers can make chemical energy and they couldn't transfer that energy to us, then there would be no way for us to get any energy as consumers. And then the very last main point is that all chemicals, so all forms of chemical energy, cycle between organisms and the environment. So that basically means that after we eat stuff, we digest the food that we eat, we take energy from that food, and then we use that energy to do stuff. And some of that energy and some of those nutrients go back into the environment after. And then other plants can grow from that.
I just want to ask. So I've heard the word decomposer before, and
Mhm.
what does that mean? Is that related to like kind of producers and consumers?
Yeah, so that's a good question, actually. So, producers, consumers, and decomposers all work together. So, like I said, with the producers, those are the ones that turn like sun energy, the light energy, into chemical energy. Consumers are the ones that eat producers or other consumers to get energy. And then decomposers are the ones that break down dead material. So, for example, let's pretend you have like, let's say, unfortunately, an animal dies, right, in a field, and there's no other animal there that's going to eat it. So, decomposers will come. Those will be like certain kinds of insects, like worms, bugs, some kinds of mushrooms are considered decomposers. And what they'll do is they'll break down that dead animal and they'll recycle all of the nutrients and energy that's inside of that animal and they'll put it back into the earth, or they'll put it into other organisms so that they can survive. And it's funny that you brought that up because I actually have that in the next slide. So the example here that I have is, it's just a small diagram that explains what's going on with consumers and producers. So we have the plant here in the middle, and it's getting energy from the sun. So the light energy from the sun comes and hits the plant. The plant converts that sunlight energy into chemical energy, and then it uses that to grow. So now the plant can grow, get bigger, gets more leaves, maybe it grows a fruit, something like that. Then you have the caterpillar over here, which is the consumer. So the caterpillar can now eat the leaves of the plant and it'll get some energy that the plant made into its body by eating the leaves. And then now the caterpillar can grow and turn into a butterfly. Another thing that will happen is when the caterpillar does some of its work to grow, it's going to lose some of its energy, right? Because it's going to give off energy as heat, which will go back into the earth to help other things grow. And then here's where the decomposers come in. So this is where I was talking about like the mushrooms. So those would be some of the fungi, bacteria, other like insects. They'll break down dead parts of the leaves and then they'll use the nutrients that they get from that to put it back into the soil to help new plants grow so that the cycle continues. And so my next question for you guys is, what are producers and what are consumers? So did anybody want to take a guess at that? Let's start with producers.
Maybe producers or like the the kind of life forms which can produce some kind of energy by itself, and
Mm-hmm.
then in this way
Yep.
maybe it's like kind of plants or producers.
Yeah. That's good. So producers
I
they're
think
organisms that convert energy from the sun into chemical energy. So yeah, basically what you said, they make their own energy and they can store that energy. What about consumers?
Teacher, I think the
They
consumer
rely on the producers to
the
get the energy.
Yeah, okay. So I appreciate that you guys are very excited to answer the questions. I'm very happy that you guys are excited to answer the questions. Well, let's try giving everybody a chance on their own first. And then if they need help, then we can jump in and help them. But thank you. That was good. Good answer. So consumers do eat producers and they rely on them to get their energy. So good job. Now, the next theme that we're going to talk about is the interaction theme. So basically, the main points here are that in all parts of life, they always have to interact with each other within their system. And what I mean by that is there has to be some kind of feedback regulation. Now, you might be asking me, what is feedback regulation? Well, feedback regulation is when the output or the end product of a process regulates the process. So there's two different kinds. There's negative and positive feedback. Negative feedback is when the end product slows down the process or the production. Positive feedback is when the end product speeds up the production. Now, I have an example here that will help explain this. Perfect example is our blood glucose. So when we go and let's say we're hungry and we go to the fridge and we get an apple, we eat the apple, what happens to our blood sugar levels? They go up. So now in our blood, we have lots and lots of glucose floating around, and our body doesn't like that. So what it does is that tells our pancreas to send out insulin into our blood, and then the insulin helps our cells absorb the glucose. And what that does is it reduces the amount of glucose inside of our blood. So this is an example of negative feedback. We put a lot of glucose into our blood, and then the end result was us lowering the amount of glucose in our blood. Now, there are cases where this doesn't work. And that's kind of the importance of the interaction theme. So just like how this system functions to keep our blood glucose levels correct and not too high or not too low, there are cases where it doesn't work properly. So an example of that would be diabetes. That's when the feedback mechanism isn't working properly. So in people who have diabetes, what happens is their body senses that the blood glucose is high, but then they don't secrete any insulin. So no insulin comes in and tries to help lower the blood glucose concentration. And you get stuck with a lot of blood glucose, which is not good. And that's what makes people with diabetes have health issues. And that's an example of where the interactions between their body are not working properly. Now, very quickly, I wanted to ask you guys, what is negative feedback and what is positive feedback? So let's give Lucas a try at that. What's negative feedback?
No, I think the negative feedback is when the accumulation of the end product slows down the production.
Yeah, good. That's exactly what it is. Now, what about positive feedback?
I think positive feedback is when the accumulation of the end product speeds up production.
Yeah, good. So like an example of that would be a good example of that is this doesn't necessarily happen in our bodies, but it's the idea of when you go to, well, when let's say your parents make you something that you really like to eat, right? You eat some of the food and you really like it. You like it a lot. So what happens next? You start to eat more of it because you like it so much. So that's an example of positive feedback because you took a bite of the food, you really liked it, and that made you want to eat even more of it over and over again. So it made you consume more of the food. Okay, good job, guys. Good job, everyone. So the next theme is one of the last ones. It's the evolution theme. Now here we have a few major things to discuss, but the main part is that evolution is the process that's transformed life on Earth, and it accounts for the unity and diversity of life. Now, what I mean by that is evolution is what explains how all of us are so similar, but we're also different at the same time. It's the idea that if you compare us to like simple animals such as like dogs, cats, or really any other animal, you know, obviously we like humans and dogs are not the same thing. Humans and cats are not the same thing. But we do share a lot of characteristics, right? For example, dogs and cats have eyes, so do we. Dogs and cats have legs, so do we, right? They have stomachs, we have stomachs. They have lungs, we have lungs. So even though we're not exactly the same, we do share characteristics, and evolution kind of explains how that's even possible. And a part of evolution is the idea of natural selection. Now, that was a theory that was proposed by Charles Darwin, and it explains adaptation. And the main idea behind natural selection is that only the surviving members of the population can pass down their traits. So that means when there's any change to the environment, only the part of the population that can survive in that new environment will be able to reproduce, and therefore only their traits will be passed down to the next generation. I have an example that will kind of explain this a little bit more in the next slide. But before we go to that, I did want to talk about how there are some categories that biologists divide all organisms up into, and they're called domains. The three basic domains are called bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And the one that us and all living animals fall under is called eukarya. And this kind of highlights the importance or kind of the idea that although we have all of these different classifications for animals and living things, we can all fall under the same group as other things that are like completely different to us. So, for example, with eukarya, humans fall under eukarya, but so do all of the living animals and plants that exist on Earth. We're all related in some way, and that's why we fall under eukarya. Whereas bacteria are so different from us that we don't fall under the same category as bacteria. Now, going back to the natural selection, I kind of wanted to go over that. So, the example that I have here is actually from the textbook, but I thought it was a very good example. So, what we see here in the first little box is it's a group of beetles, and some of them are dark and some of them are a little bit lighter, right? They're like a more shiny color. And then you have in the second box, a bird comes. But this bird is only eating the light ones, the shiny beetles. It's not eating the dark ones because it can't see them since they're on a dark background. It has a hard time seeing those ones. So then what happens is only the light ones die. And that leaves you with only the darker ones left over. So then only the darker ones are able to reproduce. And then the next generation of beetles that lives is mainly just dark beetles. So do you notice how in number 4 and number 4 has only dark beetles left over? Number 1 had a mix. There were some light ones and dark ones. So this is an example of natural selection happening. And this is kind of what happened over the course of history to make all the different kinds of animals that we have now. And this is another kind of example of that. So back to Charles Darwin, he discovered a species of finch, which is a bird, on an island. And then what he noticed is on the islands that were further away from that main island, there were different versions of those same birds that behaved a little differently. They looked different, but he realized that they came from the original bird. So what happened was there was the ancestral finch, and then the environment changed because some of them went to one island and turned into this bird. Some of them went to another island and then they split up again. And then all that created all these branching points where at the branching point you have a common ancestor that turned into two different species. And then if you go far enough back, you can see that all of these birds originally came from this ancestral finch. And that's what scientists do to try and figure out the history of species. So they've done that with humans as well. And with humans, they were able to discover that there was actually an ancestral species that came like just before us that they think is why we're so related to certain kinds of monkeys and apes. We share some characteristics with them, and the idea is that they're not saying that we're the same as them, but they're saying that we share so many characteristics with them because we share an ancestor from the past. Now, I wanted to ask you guys a couple questions again, just to check our understanding. So, what are the three main domains that scientists use to classify living organisms, and which domain are humans a part of? So let's give Stella a chance to answer that. Um, okay. It looks like they might not want to. Did anybody else want to try answering?
Maybe there's one called bacteria, and there's eukarya, and
Yeah.
I forgot the third one.
Okay, Stella, did you want to try to help him with the third one?
Sorry. I mean, I didn't open. I didn't open my. I forgot to open it, and I only think of one.
Which one?
No, just the one. It is the one that covers it. Oh no.
Oh,
Third
oh,
one.
that's okay. So you guys got bacteria and eukarya. The one that you were missing was archaea. Now, what domain are humans a part of? Does anybody want to try to answer that?
Eukarya.
Yeah, so that's eukarya. Okay, good job, guys. Yeah, so the three main domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And then the domain that humans are a part of, eukarya. So good job. It's okay if you don't know the answers right now. It's about trying. I just want you guys to try your best. Now, the last couple things that I just want to talk about is research in science and biology. So research is very important. It is how we find out new information about a lot of the stuff that we learn. Without research, we wouldn't really know any of the things that we know. We wouldn't know any of the stuff that we've talked about today. So research is very important for furthering our understanding. But the main parts of research involve collecting data. So you have to do experiments. You have to get some observations. And then you have to use what's called inductive reasoning to draw conclusions and form hypotheses. So inductive reasoning is when you use observations and facts and evidence to evaluate a situation. So that's when you look at what you're seeing, what you already know, and what evidence you have to figure out the answer to a situation. Deductive reasoning is another kind of reasoning that we use in research, and that involves using predictions. So you want to you predict to test a hypothesis by doing experiments. So the idea there is you have a hypothesis, which is your idea of what you think is going to happen. And then the way you test it is by doing an experiment. So you put your hypothesis to a test. These two reasonings are what scientists use to do research. And whenever they're doing experiments, they always do those they do controlled experiments. And what controlled experiments are is they are used to test hypotheses, but they have one variable that they're looking at. So you're only looking at the effect of one thing changing. You don't want to make the experiment too complicated because then it's too hard to understand what's happening. So, to keep things simple, scientists only observe the effect of one variable at a time in their controlled experiments, and they use that to get their evidence that they use to develop scientific theories to explain the world. And one of the main things that's important about research is that it has to be cooperative. You never do research by yourself. You always want to share your research results with other scientists, and all your experiments have to be reproducible, which basically just means that other scientists have to also be able to find the same answers that you got. And only then can your work be accepted as being true. And the main point at the end to kind of sum everything is that having more scientists work together on more things promotes progress and it helps us learn more about the world. And that's a very important way or that's a very important part of scientific research. That's why we share all of our findings. And that's why we all work together to further our understanding as a group. And so that's it for today's class. I did want to leave you guys with a little bit of homework. I know nobody likes doing homework, but I promise you, these are not very hard questions. They're very easy to do. It's just questions 1 to 4 on page 26 of the textbook. I will pull up the textbook right here. So it should be these 4 questions